I was foiled by the ONOFF switch. I just assumed it was on. Hey, there we go. Okay, so we'll get started here. My name's Jake Williams. We're going to be covering cyber false flags and adversarial counterintelligence, right? So lots of fun here. The lawyer had some fun with the talk right before. So there are a couple of tools I wanted to release. Luckily, they weren't in the show notes there, right? So, but look for those in the coming weeks once we get the legalese worked out around those, right? So in case you're curious, I don't like lawyers. Anyway, so who am I, right? So founder of Rendition InfoSec. I actually work with a firm called IONS. I'm a GSE with a GIAC. I'm not a CISSP at all, but I'm a prolific InfoSec Twitter shitposter. Formerly endorsed by the Shadow Brokers. I'm on the Rally Security podcast as a co-host. Of course, the good old Shadow Brokers folks there. I mean, not a subtle thing or anything. Love pen test, forensics, and CTI. Absolutely dislike people who call themselves thought leaders, right? Can't stand that. And blockchain, for goodness sakes. Leave it in crypto, and that's it, right? So the agenda, let's talk about false flag case studies, as well as some techniques that you can use to do your own cyber false flags. The case study thing is is it really happening in the field? And we get this question a lot. And the answer is yes, absolutely. It's happening. Unfortunately, I think it's probably happening a lot more than we know about, specifically because I think they're probably successful in a lot of cases, right? We do a lot of incident response at Rendition, and in a lot of cases, we get a chance to do second incident response, right? And that's kind of like second meal. Actually, not at all like second meal. It's kind of like coming in behind another firm and getting a chance to mop up kind of thing. And we get a chance to read a lot of reports and see some really, really bad conclusions where single indicators in many cases are used to do attribution, which is a really bad plan. You really shouldn't do that, right? And we're going to talk about why throughout this talk. Talk about copying some actor TTPs. Talk about the rich header, which is pretty awesome. If you're not familiar with it, we'll at least discuss it here, as well as encryption keys. This is something that we've seen used repeatedly for attribution, and again, just a bad plan overall. We'll talk about as well not being useful idiot, right? And if you're not familiar with this term UI or useful idiot, I think this is originally attributed back to Lenin, although it's not entirely solidly attributed back there. But basically, the idea there is somebody who is not necessarily being paid or coerced necessarily to push a narrative, but somebody who falls for the narrative and in their basically workings, it basically advances that, right? So basically, if you fall for that false flag and then come back and say, "But science, I'm doing forensics, and I see all these forensic artifacts, and that's why it's definitely Russia or definitely China or insert bad actor here," or the U.S. for that matter. I guess we could be a bad actor as well, depending on the day of the week, as well as what part of the world you're in. And then a couple of closing thoughts, right? So we'll start off with case studies in cyber false flags, right? So the first one I want to talk about here is the ISIS-linked cyber caliphate. In 2014, there was a group that emerged named the Cyber Caliphate. They began hacking a number of U.S. CENTCOM social media accounts. They actually took over CENTCOM's YouTube account, which was mildly not funny, as it turns out. They posted actually some really nasty videos of soldiers getting blown up. And again, bear in mind, this is the thing that CENTCOM is sharing on Facebook. Spouses back home or basically tuning into this to see basically news about, their loved ones in the field. And all of a sudden, ISIS, believed to be ISIS, the Cyber Caliphate takes this over and starts posting some pretty horrendous stuff, right? Some pretty horrendous propaganda. Nothing to do with Russia, by the way, 100% to do with ISIS, right? So pretty strong link there, right? One, they came out and said, "Hey, we're ISIS," right? Now, look, we all fall for a lot of these. We're hardwired, right, in a lot of cases for cognitive biases as well as some logical fallacies. And what we fell into here is a confirmation bias, right? Of course, again, they came out and said, I understand why. They came out and said, "We're ISIS." And they did like ISIS-like things, right? Showing ISIS propaganda videos and showing soldiers getting blown up and they doxed thousands of military members, including some home addresses. They released a ton of troop movement data, unit rosters, etc. Most of what they released, as it turns out, under investigation later, we determined was basically, or the U.S. determined, was already probably publicly available through other leaks, right? So the Russians didn't even work very hard on this. But it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, it still looked really bad at the time, right? I guess looks really bad still, regardless. In 2015, though, they took it a step further, and the Cyber Caliphate took down France's TV5 Monde. They took them off the air. They actually did a destructive cyber attack. And this is probably where they went a couple of steps too far, right? And I say too far because up to this point, there was some suspicion that this might not be ISIS, but nobody really had any proof, right? It was kind of a, one analyst says, well, this is a little too brazen. It doesn't really look like ISIS, and it looks like it could be propaganda. And when you think propaganda, let's just be fair, right? I mean, I'm going to say I have a confirmation bias towards Russia. Of course, that might have something to do with my past as well, where they kind of outed me and whatever. But alas, as you think about this, right, with these whole indicators here, when they came in and hacked the French TV station and performed the destructive cyber attack, this is the point where we can really step back and start doing incident response. And now this is where it's hard to pull off a convincing cyber false flag, right? You can do a few things well, but doing everything well is pretty impossible. And that's one of the points we're going to touch on today, is that if you're doing good, full, wholesome forensics, right? Wholesome forensics, you're likely to uncover the false flag. Now, if you're relying on one or two indicators in isolation, this is where you're likely to trip up and become that UI, right, that we talked about a minute ago here. This was an excellent false flag attack, though, because people had been saying for some time, hey, ISIS is going to do badness. They're going to enter the cyber domain, and we can't believe they're not already here. And sure enough, then they showed up. And people are like, yes, they're here, right? And again, I think there was a lot of confirmation bias that played into this. And roll forward here, or kind of in parallel, give or take, in the same time period, we see the Sony hack, right? And so North Korea attempted to hide behind a hacktivist group when they targeted Sony in November 2014. The U.S. government came back and said, no, it was definitely the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. By the way, why is it precisely that everybody who seems to be a communist regime wants to use democratic in their name there? I never understood that, but rock on. Regardless here, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, hackers there, they repeatedly called themselves different hacktivist groups. Now, this is barely convincing, although, right, when we start coming in, I talked about we're hardwired to want to, basically to want to see, some of these cognitive biases and logical fallacies. And we are also, it turns out, there's been lots of studies on this. We're really hardwired to want a good conspiracy, right? And so this plays into this, as it turns out. There are still people that argue that this was a hacktivist group, despite all evidence to the contrary, right? And it's because they hide behind hacktivist groups, and they have consistently. Most of these hacktivist groups, though, very interestingly, have never been heard from before or since. They're kind of one-operation hacktivist groups, is that they like come together, right? Like Wonder Twin powers activate, right? And they come together and then never seen or heard from again, which is really interesting. But Guardians of Peace was one of the names there. The Who Is team. This was really cool because not cool if you were one of the victims, but the splash screen that came up when they basically bricked the boxes there, when they were basically wiping the drives, the one that popped up came up and said, who is, right? Which was kind of neat. I mean, it was a neat play on English there, but alas, the New Romantic Cyber Army is yet another one of their little hacking teams there. Then we roll forward to 2018, and we see the Olympic Destroyer. Olympic Destroyer malware gets deployed during the 2018 Olympics in Seoul, right? And again, I'm looking at a confirmation bias here is probably what's going on, because we quickly attributed it to North Korea. One, because, there were a lot of indicators that kind of pointed there, right? First off, the North and the South, you may have heard aren't exactly getting along. And so, also, they had the whole, there were lots of indicators in the PE header, that tied it back to the portable executable header, tied it back to, other North Korean malware. Roll forward, though, researchers noticed some coding similarities, right? So as you dive deeper than the header, there are some coding similarities to some Russian malware. Nothing conclusive, right? Because when we talk about similarities, at the end of the day, right, Ed Scotus, I think, very famously said, right, that if he wanted to emulate the U.S. government, he would just pull apart Stuxnet and basically use techniques from Stuxnet, and that would literally be it. People would forever say that was the U.S. government, and I don't debate that, right? I think that people would largely latch on to that. Regardless here, nothing really conclusive. Again, a good technique is a good technique. The problem here is they sucked at tradecraft because researchers discovered that the malware had been uploaded 2 weeks before to a scanning service in Eastern Europe. And this scanning service, as a matter of fact, when they uploaded it with the name olymp.exe, OOYMP.exe. And the PE header, the artifacts in the PE header, specifically the rich header, right? It turns out 100% aligned with Russian malware. So basically, they uploaded to the scanning service to make sure that it wasn't going to get caught by antivirus, right? Validated that 2 weeks before they deployed it, went back, did their anti-forensics corrections, right? So this is just an OPSEC slip-up is the reason that we can conclusively or fairly conclusively say. Now, Now look, I say conclusively because, in the whole like fashion a hat out of aluminum foil world, right, we could possibly have a case where the North Koreans, right, pivoted through a Eastern European box with different rich headers and then uploaded it there to kind of plant that seed, right? But I think all things being equal, I think it probably looks a lot more Russian than North Korean. It looks like they had intentionally replaced that rich header, which is a piece of the portable executable header that we use for attribution in some cases, before the binary got deployed, right? So again, not 100% conclusive, but looks pretty bad that it's probably Russia, right? And I would be remiss not to talk about the US here, right? Because the Vault 7 dumps on WikiLeaks, and I have to be very careful and call this allegedly from the CIA, document a program called Umbrage. Many believe that this program was used to create U.S. government malware that would be confused for commodity malware or tools used by other state actors, right? Now, again, you can debate the authenticity of the WikiLeaks dumps. At the end of the day, whether they came from the CIA or not, there are folks out there today who largely believe that this Umbrage program is evidence that the U.S. is engaged in cyber false flag operations as well, right? So that's really the takeaway here, regardless of your belief along those lines. Roll forward again, we're looking at 2016 here, actually backing up a little bit technically from the Vault 7 dump. In 2016, you probably know about Guccifer 2 or Guccifer 2 or whatever. I'm not going to argue the dude's the pronunciation here, but dropped a number of documents that claim to be stolen from the DNC. And they claim to be 100% authentic documents. Of course, they would never modify anything before they leaked that data. Why would they, right? But as it turns out, document metadata clearly indicates the documents were modified. It took me about 3 minutes to see this because I'm pretty sure that at the DNC, they weren't running Quest Diagnostics as the company, and Ernesto Che probably was not the person authoring the document, right? So a quick Google search will tell you that, he's a very popular communist sympathizer there, as well as some really interesting metadata here. I would question whether or not anybody at the DNC is typing in Cyrillic as their default code page. Again, now I can't tell you about the data underlying in the documents, right? I'm not making any judgment about that whatsoever. I want to be very, very clear about that. What I can say is that the document metadata is not consistent with data that was stolen directly from the DNC. Right now, some people have pointed to this and said, "Hey, that was horrible tradecraft by the Russians." Right now, I think we've got enough evidence in the totality of evidence, right, to say that this was probably the Russians. Right. Of course, there are lots of people wearing tinfoil hats about that as well. If you doubt, there's actually a whole website dedicated to this, right, and proving me wrong 100%, named g2.space, right? And if you are ever feeling like, hey, I want to dive into the rabbit hole and see how far insanity goes, just open up a web browser, type g2.space, and you will read all kinds of forensics, air quotes, right? And you can see all kinds of stuff. There's a gentleman named Adam Carter, right, who publishes this, and there's another unnamed person named, quote, Forensicator, who does a lot of publication there and makes lots of leaps to conclusions, right? Like in one case, they're very convinced that it must be an inside hack and not the Russians, because nobody has basically in order for the transfer speeds that they conclude, right, with download speeds, your download speed would have to be greater than 100 megs at the DNC. Right? They would have to have an internet pipe greater than 100 megs, right? I mean, I have gigabit fiber to my house, right? I'm not, neat. It's cool, right? And I guess like if you were trying to dispel, and you're like trying to kick some rumors in here and seed some, or sow some seeds of doubt, that would probably work like if everybody around you like was on DSL, but we're not, right? And so nor were we in 2016, and I'm positive DNC headquarters had some better documents here. This one was really convincing though, because that was last modified by you'll notice here that I had a total edit time of 2 minutes, but they managed to type 231 pages, right? And I type fast, but I don't type that fast, right? Now, this particular document, there was a lot made in the news about this, and I'm not going to go political here, but this was the Trump opposition research that was released by the DNC, right? Now, there was a lot made to do about this, like where they were like, oh my gosh, first the Republicans talked about it, and the Democrats talked about it, but again, the authenticity on the side of that was, well, we can't really say anything about the authenticity of the document, right? Whether or not it was copied. Well, I'll tell you for sure it was copied and pasted. I mean, nobody typed 231 pages in 2 minutes, right? That just didn't happen. But regardless, still, alas, this one's my favorite though. 2017, we had Ukrainian citizens actually doing their own false flag operations. Forget APT. This is post-NotPetya, right? So For those that don't know, NotPetya was actually deployed using a piece of software called MEDOC. And basically, they abused the Russians abused the update mechanism for this for the software. Lots of background here. MEDOC is used for filing taxes, and they have about a 70% in Ukraine. You can only use this software, or one of two pieces of software. One was Ukrainian; they enjoyed about a 70% market share. The other was Russian, and they enjoyed about a 30% market share. The Ukrainians basically said, "Hey, this is the last year you can use the Russian software to file your business taxes," right? And then NotPetya happened, right? Now, I'm not saying that that was the only motive for it, right? But certainly there's some signaling going on there. But because of the whole tax interruption thing, they kind of stepped back and said, look, we understand files got destroyed, and obviously you need more time to deal with this. So if you were hit with NotPetya, right, and you have a credible police report that shows you were hit with NotPetya, because they would come out and look and see the splash screen, that you were all basically toast. And anyway, so this enterprising Ukrainian businessman, he's like, hey, cool, I can actually get a copy of NotPetya and infect myself, right? He didn't actually get infected originally, but he infected himself to basically get a delay, as well as to destroy documents, right? That would have been, basically, if you had those documents destroyed and had no backups, they gave you some leniency around a lot of that, right? So he was like, oh, yeah, no problem, I'll just destroy. Then he uploaded to I think it was SendSpace or SendFile, something along those lines, a cloud file sharing service, and published on his blog instructions for how you too could get a delay in filing your taxes, right? By false flagging yourself as Russian attackers, right? And again, it's funny, it's kind of laughable in the sense that, wow, I can't believe somebody did that, but at the same time, it illustrates this is not just a nation-state level kind of thing, right? And I would argue that there are probably countless other examples of this out there that we don't know about, right? I don't mean this specifically, but people doing weird, individuals doing weird false flag operations for different motivations, right? So let's talk about some of the techniques. I want to start with some disclaimers because lawyers, right? None of this is something that we don't suspect attackers have already done in intrusions. I did one talk one time before and released a tool set around anti-forensics, and I got so much hate mail, it was ridiculous. Look, if you're in forensics, I'm sorry, right? Definitely we're going to talk about some stuff. I have no doubt that after we talk about this, we will see more of this in the wild, right? But the fact that we see more of it in the wild does not mean that more of it is happening in the wild. Let's be very clear about that. What it means is that we're seeing more of it. In many cases, that's because our eyes are open to it, right? So don't send me hate mail. Don't firebomb my office. Don't whatever, right? Number two, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not your lawyer. Talk to yours before doing any of this. I'm thankful I did because he said hold off on releasing two tools, right? So once we get the legalese set around those, we will get those released and out. Before false flagging a red team operation, talk to the customer because this may not be cool with them at all, right? I will share a horror story around this. Where we were actively engaged in a penetration test, and we were false flagging something, and one person there knew that we were false flagging, and they actually asked us to, I said a pen test, it was really an adversarial emulation. Red team, they asked us specifically to emulate APT22, and we did a lot, and somebody caught us, and there were only two people in the organization in the know, and only one of them knew that we were emulating APT22. And so they kicked off an incident response and engaged a third party who concluded that we were APT22 at great expense. And when that outbrief occurred, no one was happy. We do not consult with that customer anymore. Not our choice, theirs. They were not happy, to say the least. Talk to people a lot, right? We have different procedures in place today, as you can imagine. There's no such thing as a perfect false flag operation. You need to know how to do real forensics. PBF stands for push button forensicating, and that is what the vast majority of the people out there that we see doing, that's basically what they do, right? They press a button and it prints a report, and that's pretty much all that happened on the machine. If that's what you're doing, you absolutely may be susceptible to this, right? If you're doing real forensics where you're correlating artifacts using that gray matter between your ears, right? That keyboard to chair interface, that's where the rubber meets the road. So let's talk about some of the false flagging techniques we can use. Number one, sharing infrastructure with the attacker. Attackers really only have three ways to obtain a command and control server. Number one, deploy it in their own IP ranges. This is dumb. They generally don't do this, although it is ridiculously convincing when they do. Because when they do, and we've seen this, right? People come back and they're like, no nation-state attacker would just come from their home IP range. And then people argue about, we see direct traffic coming out of Iran, and they're like, that can't be Iran. Iran wouldn't be that stupid. And I have lots of evidence that Iran is indeed Iran, please don't hack us, that Iran is indeed, in some cases, Iranian operations and others, for that matter, let's not just pick on Iran, have been that bad, right? So that could be the case. We could also lease IP space from a virtual private server farm. We could compromise vulnerable hosted applications like Joomla or Drupal or WordPress. And I'm told now that if you just look at Joomla the wrong way, it falls over. But regardless, look, the latter of these obviously is not appropriate for red team operations because you probably don't want to commit a felony to deliver a better red team assessment, right? That's just a bad plan, right? But attackers do share infrastructure, right? So the idea that attackers don't is kind of laughable. We've got documented evidence of this in our own investigations, but something I can talk about publicly or we can point to publicly actually was brought out of a Kaspersky report. Kaspersky talked about this machine they call the magnet of threats, right? Because this is actually one of the first places they found the equation group, which is largely believed to be the U.S. government. Basically, with this equation group, they also found Flame. They found Animal Farm, which is France. They found Corrado, which is Spain. Turla, which is Russia. Right, so we're looking at now a total of 6 different APT groups, minimum 6 different APT groups on a single machine. Attackers share infrastructure, right? Documented evidence of this, no question, right? Now, whether it's infrastructure, redirection infrastructure, or targets, I suspect this is probably an end target. But regardless, still a reasonable, piece of proof that we can point to and say, we've seen this occur, right? And so we've seen it occur. Again, I've got countless other examples of this that I can't share specifically. Sometimes attackers are aware of each other, we believe. Other times they're not. In one case, we actually saw 3 attackers on the same machine. 2 of them were aware of each other. One of them was unaware of the other 2 entirely. Which was kind of weird, but, and the 2 appear to be, unaware of the third, right? So it was a very, very weird relationship there. We know that the 2 were aware of each other because they were passing each other notes. And so one of them actually argued with the other. These were not nation-state actors, obviously, at least the 2, but argued with, one of the notes was just absolutely awesome. I will never work this forensics case again, I'm certain, where it said, if you don't get off, I know who you are, I know where you live, if you don't get off this box, I will call the FBI and report you. And I'm dying to know how that call was going to go, right? We were like, so I hacked a machine, and there's another hacker there, and he won't get off, and so I'd like you to go arrest him if you could for, I don't work a lot with the FBI, but I'm pretty sure that doesn't fly, right? So, look, obviously you can't go hack somebody else's server, but you could buy infrastructure, right? So, now whether or not this is effective simply to come from another country, just ask Norse, because Norse attributed all of the ICS scanning to Iran based solely on IP addresses. Now look, Norse, I don't want to kick a CT, now, I can't even say CTI. I don't want to kick a defunct company while they're down. But look, at the end of the day, right, obviously they made some mistakes here. But TLDR, they're not the only ones, right? We regularly see attribution performed largely on IP addresses. And so the question is, how do I go get infrastructure in some, I don't want to say weird country, but some non-standard country, right? I can go on AWS and I can go and get infrastructure in Singapore or Japan or the US or the UK, right? But like if I want to go get something in Iran, it turns out no problem, because WHTOP has a listing of over 2,100 VPS providers around the world, many in really, really interesting locations like, well, Iran. And it turns out it is ridiculously easy to buy one. I've done this repeatedly as we've done adversarial emulation, right? Now, I want to be very clear. If you go lease a server in Iran, you should not be putting your tools or exfil or literally anything on that, right? This thing is a redirector only, where you're pushing an encrypted tunnel through this bad boy, right? And that is it. And I mean it, right? But it does create a convincing, convincing threat here, right? We've had folks. How many folks in here do pen testing or red teaming? A few? Yeah. Right? I consistently have people that are like, we didn't see you because you came from the US. How many folks have heard this one before, right? We were looking for Chinese IP addresses, right? I'm like, wow, okay, well, that's all it takes. Okay, good to go. Don't tell your attacker that, right? But alas, right, if you need to threat model that, right? If somebody says that and they're like, hey, we would have seen you if you came from a Chinese IP, and you want to be like, hold my beer, right? You totally can, right? You totally can. Excuse me. And very cheaply, as it turns out. Let's talk about faking personas, right? So this is another thing that we do quite a bit. And attackers use these supporter networks when they create personas. Dell SecureWorks actually put this one together here. And you'll notice what's happening here effectively is that they have these core personas. They also have what they call supporter personas, or I say what we call, at least in the cyber threat intelligence field, supporter personas. And so here we would basically use these effectively or they use these effectively so that, when you get a LinkedIn invitation or a Twitter invite or something, I'll tell you one of the first things I do, I check like how old is the account, right? And then are they followed by anybody? I mean, ideally, they're like followed by somebody I know or connected to somebody I know, but absent that, like the raw number of people they're followed by tells me something. If you're like a Twitter egg who's got like 0 followers or 1 follower, I'm probably like out, right? I'm probably like in that mode of like, right? As a matter of fact, now Twitter with the quality filter just won't even show it to me, but you get the idea, right? Here, if we're looking at this, what they're doing here effectively is propping up these personas with all these supporter accounts. And if you've identified one of these networks, and if you work in cyber threat intelligence or red teaming, you probably have already, at least in the CTI side you have, and if you work in a red team, you probably have access to a CTI team or just Google it, right? Grab one of these personas and literally become a new supporter account, right? Now, bear in mind, they're not going to follow you back, right? But that's not really important. One, you're kind of doing them a favor, and this is why I said talk to a lawyer, right? Because you're now kind of propping them up in an investigation in an operation, right? You're actually increasing their legitimacy. This is why I say talk to a lawyer, be smart about this, right? But again, if you're looking here, right, if we follow these folks, it doesn't really matter whether or not they follow us back because, again, right, these are known personas at this point for a specific threat group in operation in the technically in North Africa and the Middle East, right? So another thing that we see a lot is that threat actors regularly use free email services like Yahoo. Yeah, they still exist, right? Every time they're in the news, like I saw yesterday, they had a big outage. Have you noticed this? They're like, outage impacted. And I was waiting for the number, right? Like, is the number like tens of people, right? And it turns out, no, it still was hundreds of thousands of people, right? But alas, a lot of these attackers use Yahoo. Obviously, Gmail, Proton Mail is common. There are a few others out there, right? But these free email addresses, if you register a lookalike email address through one of these, you will absolutely create confusion among analysts. We live to make connections. We live to make links, right? To link stuff together. In fact, in the SANS CTI course, we talk about link analysis quite a bit. I'll just mention here again that is something that we do consistently, whether it's commercial or government CTI. People are creatures of habit. Your attackers are no different, right? They do gravitate to common naming schemes for this stuff. If you identified one of those and you create infrastructure or create email addresses with those, you will create a pretty convincing false flag. Now convincing meaning single data point, right? And obviously, right, it has to be something that can, that your CTI analysts are going to be able to make the connection on, right? There's always this, how obvious do you make it versus like, how not obvious do you make it, right? Because if it's too obvious, it's, too obvious, right? But if it's not obvious enough, the analyst on the other side may not make the connection and your ruse is no good. You've done a bunch of work for nothing, right? But alas, again, if this sounds too simple to work, I'm just going to tell you right off the bat, we have seen this, we have used this, and people have fallen for it consistently. And we've had to go back and say, hey, this is really us. And they were like, how would I have known that? And the answer is you wouldn't, right? You literally then have to take this one indicator and you have to look at the totality of the evidence. And again, we'll talk more about that as we close out the talk today. Same goes for infrastructure like blog hosting, right? Social media usernames, etc. Guccifer 2.0, obviously, as the name implies, was not the first, right? He was the sequel to the original Guccifer, right? And, we could, for instance, try and capitalize on that, right? I'll tell you, if a Guccifer 3.0 or 4.0 comes out, I'm going to immediately think Russia, right? It's going to be an anchoring bias of mine. I'm going to try to make that connection. Now, I'm going to be honest, I would also have in the back of my mind possible false flag. This is the problem, by the way, is once you start considering, is this a false flag? You can drive yourself nuts, right? Because you can be like, well, maybe they did that, so I think it was a false flag. And then you might be like, well, maybe they did that thinking that I think it was a false flag. And then you can, and you get like 8 steps removed and it gets absolutely nuts, right? It's like Beautiful Mind Home Edition, right? Anyway, so look, as we come back here, Guccifer 3.0, interesting note here, when I was doing a talk 2 years ago on the DNC hack, I went to register Guccifer3.wordpress.com. He actually released a bunch of his stuff at Guccifer2.wordpress.com. I couldn't get it then, but I do have Guccifer 4, and have shirtless Putin riding a shark, right? So, outstanding. Anyway, so messing with compile times. This is another big one here. The portable executable header, the PE format, turns out, in the header, actually has an embedded timestamp, right? The embedded timestamp is in UTC, right? So there's no time zone associated with this. Now, I'll mention here that we have observed in the past that traditionally operators, your attackers, your hackers, work whatever hours the target happens to be up, but your developers typically work a 9-ish to 5-ish kind of office hours schedule. Now, one piece of malware, one tool recovered from the attacker is not enough to mess with compile time. It's not enough to understand, is this just an isolated event, this compile time. But if I get enough of these, if I've got a group of tools from an attacker, either over an intrusion where you find 20 or 30 different tools deployed, or, in the case of a long-standing campaign, right, a number of other tools here, we can start plotting these on a map and kind of look at what time zone do these align with office hours. And now, you're not going to pinpoint a time zone with this. I want to be very, very clear about that. But generally, you can cut out about a little over 60% of the map, right, give or take, and the cluster will point you into 3 or 4 time zones, really kind of in the center of that cluster, right? So again, not 100% convincing, but I want to be very clear here. This is stupid easy to change. You can do this at home with a hex editor. Requires zero work, right? Well, obviously the work to change it with a hex editor, but I mean, not rocket science kind of thing here. This is not nation state level stuff. I want to mention Rtp Logs. This is another big one that we see again and again and again, and I'm pretty convinced on at least 2 occasions an attacker has used this to false flag us. Rtp Logs, when an attacker logs into or uses Rtp to log into a target, they leave behind their machine name in most cases, and domain name is part of the default login. All right, now I say in most cases, I don't have time to dive into the details of RDP forensics. That could be a whole talk on its own. But I'll mention here the RDP logs are interesting because they have a much longer lifespan than security event logs, right? Security event logs tend to roll over on most machines, depending on logging configuration, every 30 to 60-ish days. My RDP logs on a typical workstation tend to have about a year to 2-year lifespan, right? So these things live a lot longer, as it turns out. And so by simply making an RDP connection, and I can do that by redirecting through infrastructure that I already own inside the target, I can leave behind a host name or a domain name that I would like you to correlate. And again, I can pull this from an existing CTI report, and people, again, I'm positive will gravitate towards the what we're trying to get there. Now I'll mention here, and this is really, really slick, in a lot of situations, and this is due to actually NLA, network level authentication, logs get created just by connecting, right? Now a lot of this depends on your settings on your machine, but if you have open NLA enabled, right, basically where it's like NLA without authentication, effectively, right? NLA is going to log that domain name and host name before the attack, literally just when the login screen pops up, not when they actually log in. And this leads to all kinds of bad forensics conclusions down the road there, right? So we'll talk about rich headers as well, right? And I mentioned this early on when we talked about Olympic Destroyer, right? So with the rich headers, basically, this is in the very, very early portion of the PE header. So actually right after this program cannot be run in DOS mode, right? We're all familiar with like the MZ, right? Mark Zabowski there. I would love to be Mark, by the way. Can you imagine going into an interview, right? And they're like, do you have any qualifications? Be like, do you have a hex editor? What a mic drop kind of moment there, right? And turns out that if you actually look in the reason we call this the rich header, it was actually written by a gentleman, unsurprisingly, named Rich. It turns out that if you look in your PE header, scroll down a little bit further past this program cannot be run in DOS mode, you'll see the letters RICH, capital R, lowercase ICH. And it turns out that data that's in there, right, it's a lot of data. I'm bad math. I think we're looking at 80 bytes, 80 or 96. I can't remember right off the top of my head. Regardless here, that has all the tool chain information that was used to go build the executable, the specific compiler version and the specific linker versions, as well as the number of input files passed to the compiler. This is absolutely epic. It's awesome. Now, I'll mention here that .NET, MingW, and GCC don't include the rich header. This by itself is interesting, right? Because when I see one that doesn't have a rich header, I kind of step back and I'm like, cool. It used to just be Microsoft compilers. Intel compilers started doing this as well. Now, I'll mention here that a large number of tools out there already decode these for you. Now, Microsoft does not publish a list of, when you see this compiler ID, basically it's a 2-byte compiler ID. When you see that 2-byte compiler ID, they don't tell you like what that is. There's no like reverse lookup for that. Microsoft holds that close to the vest. Right? Now, they had a leak of some tools, almost 10 years ago. So like everything before that's known, but like everything in the last 10 or 12 years isn't. And so there's a lot of guessing going on around that. But I'll mention that when a developer gets a tool chain in place, they generally don't mess with it because you ultimately have to make code changes really to fix a lot of the stuff, right? So I'll mention like that the attackers here know this, obviously. We saw the Russians actually replace the rich header with Olympic Destroyer, and that's actually what led to the early attribution to North Korea. I'll also mention that, and I'm totally going to butcher this dude's name, but Maxim Dubik published a paper this year in the SANS reading room, and it is phenomenal. If he had come to me with this hypothesis, I'd have bet money against it, but he can actually reasonably reliably detect malware using nothing but the rich header. Right? So looking at like a clean data set and a malware data set, he is better than average programmatically detecting, right? So now I'm not saying I want to replace antivirus with this dude's technique, right? But it is a really interesting technique. Highly recommend that you go download this. Obviously, I'll upload these slides and tweet out a link to these and whatever. Let's talk about typed URLs, right? So when you type a URL, not when you click a link, but when you type a URL into Explorer or Edge, why would you use Internet Explorer or Edge? But usually the answer is that you're logged onto a server and you don't have anything else installed, honestly, right? And so you pop open that server there, or pop open Explorer on the server. I'll mention here that attackers often, when they RDP onto a machine, will open Internet Explorer and paste in a URL, right? Now, in many cases, when they're RDP'd on, right? So think about like your Azure instances where you have RDP exposed to the internet, the attacker manages to compromise credentials or uses Bluekeep, or, by the way, did anybody see Bluekeep? There's an actual exploit release for that in Metasploit as of today, like this afternoon. Yeah, nasty. Anyway, so alas, they Bluekeep on or whatever. If you're not patched for Bluekeep at this point, you almost deserve it. But anyway, look, bottom line there, then we go look at the typed URLs. Here's what the structure looks like, right? And you'll notice here URL 1. And again, these are going to one up with every URL. And I'll mention here that if the key gets deleted, we know the numbers restart at 1. Sometimes they age off, right? Sometimes you do this through clearing history. Other times anti-forensics tools like CCleaner, or like my mom calls it, CCleaner, are used. Whatever the case is there. Bottom line here is with some surgery, by using this incredibly awesome reg command, we're able to go in and add in this domain. And if you don't recognize this one, this is a known Russian C2 domain brought to you by NKIC. This is one that was included in the Grizzly Step report, right? Now, BE3.exe, Black Energy 3, probably a little too obvious, right? I'd probably want to use one of their known executable names, right? But again, this is the kind of thing that we plant, and I'm going to be honest, 9 out of 10 forensic investigators are going to look at this and say, 1, this URL was typed in. Well, that's not necessarily the case. Let's be very clear about this. What we can say is that there's a registry key in typed URLs that normally correlates to a user typing or pasting a URL into Explorer. And we have to be really cagey about the way that we clarify our language. But this is where things get really cool, because if I really wanted to drag somebody down a rabbit hole and I thought they were going to involve law enforcement, or like nation statey kind of stuff, right? I might go register like a file sharing account like Dropbox, for instance, right? And then actually use a known bad tool name, right? That's another Russian tool name there, and APT28 specifically. And then this here, this is a unique identifier. Dropbox used to actually include with the share links a user ID here, and it was a numeric user ID, and they've stopped doing that. That's actually great from a privacy perspective, right? Because now we can't correlate that multiple share links belong to the same user. That said, still with subpoena power, you can go back to Dropbox, and they can come back and tell you the user that did this. Now, I want you to back up another step here and think about if you had already used a lookalike email address, right, to register this, and you can see how, like, you can start putting stuff together, and all of a sudden now it's not one artifact, it's multiple artifacts, right? The email address used to register correlates to Russia. The download name does, right? Maybe the account name used here with Dropbox, etc. Right? Now, again, not picking on Russia specifically, just kind of throwing that out there as a, maybe blame it on Russia or not, whatever, right? Bottom line, as we forward on here, word wheel query is another great one. Word wheel query stores search terms used in the Explorer UI. Now, this is where I'm going to pick on China, because I'm going to say China loves RDP. If you look at their tools, some of their tools specifically have RDP redirection built into them. Like, they can do generic TCP redirection, but in case you don't even know what port RDP is on, like you can't type 3389 reliably, they have a separate function built into some of their malware just to redirect RDP. It literally does, basically wraps that other piece to redirect 3389. But in a lot of cases here, they're going to go do a search, right, in the GUI. And when they do that search in the GUI, ouch, right? So what does that actually look like? Well, it turns out here it's actually encoded, right? And I've actually heard investigators come back and say, well, we know that's better because it's encoded. My friends, this is not encoding. My goodness. I mean, this is ASCII codes, right, with a null byte. This is little endian Unicode, right? That's all it is. And so you can see here effectively that we can go in and replace, right? Let's say, for instance, that I wanted to replace what was originally a search for the word nothing with a search for top secret, right? Now, this is really, really attractive because the attackers, one of the hardest things we have with attackers is trying to infer intent, right? And of course, here we're trying to plant a seed about what was the attacker looking for, right? Now, if you were going to steal something and you wanted to point them away from that thing you're stealing and point them somewhere else, I think this is a great way to do it. I hate to tell you, like a couple of years ago, I'd have totally fallen for this, right? So anyway, talk about recent docs, right? So if we're logged into the GUI, again, RTP, consider opening a few documents that you're not remotely interested in. This is actually going to create a bunch of link files, which you can also fake with PowerShell, right? Again, these show up in recent docs and a bunch of registry keys I don't have time to cover here either. Talk about artifacts of execution, right? And I'm going to blow through this, right? Because time, we've got a lot of stuff to cover still. But we've got prefetch, shimcache, amcache, and user assist. And prefetch, it turns out here, is not enabled typically when we have SSD machines. This one's becoming a little bit less reliable for us to do. But it turns out the machine name is not coded in the prefetch file at all. Right? So the prefetch file doesn't code the machine name at all. What they do code in is the MFT and USN references as well as a volume serial number. But what this means is that if you're not paying attention, and by the way, most of our tools don't extract this information, right? Many of our tools don't extract this information. And so if you're not paying attention, even if they do, are you actually comparing the volume serial number, right, with the, most people, again, are not. The tools certainly are not automatically doing that. And so again, here, if we create a prefetch file on our machine, we can then upload that and indicate that something was executed that in fact really wasn't. With shimcache, shimcache is another great artifact of execution. Again, this doesn't necessarily indicate the executable is run, but it does store the last write time and the full path of the file. Another big one here, right? Now I'll mention shimcache is only written to the registry during shutdown. Tools exist to go extract it from memory, but they are less commonly used by investigators. I'll mention that amcache stores the full path of the executable and a SHA-1 hash. This is another great one here, right? Now, I technically have to go run this, but picture this. I go upload a piece of malware, a pen testing tool, whatever, that looks totally like APT22, right? It doesn't get flagged. I upload it to VirusTotal. You later go run amcache parser, right? You see the SHA-1, go over to VTI, download the copy of it because it's no longer on the machine, right? Download the copy of it, see a bunch of strings that relate to APT22, game on, right? And again, we're looking confirmation bias here. Finally, artifacts of execution with user assist, right? So user assist is basically looking at stuff that is double-clicked or run from the GUI, right? So if you run it from the command line, you don't actually get a user assist key put in place. You do get a run count with this, but we're less interested in the forensic side of this. Then, again, bear in mind, this is sitting right here in ntuser.dat. It's ROT13 encoded, which, again, is not, it's ROT13, right? So game on. What about encryption keys, right? So encryption keys are easily recovered from PowerShell scripts. And look, attackers love PowerShell, right? We've seen a lot of this. Obviously, you can recover these from other malware as well, compiled malware. But I'll mention when we go use keys for attribution, you want to examine whether or not the algorithm is symmetric or asymmetric. Symmetric keys are trivial to reuse, right? Because the same key encrypts and decrypts, right? So I could use a key that the attacker has used previously. And again, I've seen malware reverse engineers, as well as Yara rules for that matter, that match on the file and then go, they're like, oh, that's definitely fancy bear. Definitely is not the word we want to use there, right? So I want to be very, very careful about that. Now with asymmetric, we only have one side of the key pair. Now, we evaluate evidence for attribution. We value symmetric keys far more highly if it hasn't been published in a CTI report because, well, are the attackers really going to fake it? How well known is it, right? Now, look, the false flag side of this, I do want it to be published in a CTI report. I want it to be obvious for the investigator. I want them to make that connection, make that link, right? So on the asymmetric side, I'll mention here you can still use those for false flag. You just have to realize everything you're exfilling, you can't actually look at later, right? Well, I take that back. There were some folks at Black Hat, some crypto clowns that can break RSA, or at least they claim they can break RSA, and we'll see. I hope they can't, because I'll be shaving my head and doing some other stuff there. But anyway, so let's close it out here. Don't be a useful idiot, right? Look, bottom line, don't become fixated on a single artifact, right? I've covered a bunch here. I've only literally just scratched the surface. We brainstormed a ton of other stuff that we could have put in this presentation. Lawyers took a couple things out of the presentation. Alas, look, bottom line, actively avoid anchoring on a single artifact to attribute the intrusion. We have to look at the totality of the evidence, right? Treat any potential false flag like any other potential anti-forensic activity. We always talk about hunting the negative space. Look for what's not there, right? Event log deletion has become a very common thing today with the release of the shadow brokers tools. Consistently, we see people using that. We've seen people repurpose those tools. These are, again, it's something that we're seeing consistently now that we didn't used to see. What I will say is most people suck at deleting event logs. They delete like the one that has their actual username in it. So there's a log on, but there's no, they delete the log on, but they forget to delete the log off, right? This is huge, right? So that's one for us. Look for anomalies again, right? So chains of things that should be there and you're missing a few of them, or a few of them look weirdly inserted. Sometimes knowledge that a false flag was attempted is good enough without needing to know specifically what happened, right? And then the devil's in the details. Little things like incorrect volume serial numbers and prefetch. I mentioned this specifically. This can really point to planted evidence. And I got to tell you, at the point that we see that, we are deep diving every individual artifact on the machine. This is going to be a very expensive, very complex investigation because it has to be if you want ground truth, right? Secondarily, I'll mention that all too often during incident response and even forensics, we're processing way too much data to go validate every field of every artifact. Right? Time is not on our side, right? If you're using an EDR system out there today, you know all about this, right? We are querying tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of machines looking literally for that needle in a haystack, right? And now that we have attackers that we know are actively trying to mess with our forensics and perform not just anti-forensics, but false flag forensics, right? Again, I want you to think about how much more difficult it is. Now you're not necessarily hunting for a needle in a haystack. You may be hunting for a piece of hay in a haystack, right? The reality is that false flags are going to become more common. They're going to become more sophisticated, and our forensics tools have to improve. So I'll drop a couple of key takeaways here. We brainstormed way more false flag attacks than we had time to present in the presentation. Most of the techniques that we presented today are wicked easy to implement. Nothing that we discussed requires nation-state level funding. The most expensive thing that we discussed was buying infrastructure in another country. And look, let's be honest, you're going to buy infrastructure anyway. There's just a little bit added level of complication there, getting the currency conversion and maybe getting that call from Amex where they're like, hey, did you really authorize a charge in Iran, right? Which does happen. Anyway, by the way, how ironic that American Express is accepted by Iranian VPSs, but whatever. Anyway, look, be on the lookout for potential false flags. Trust your gut, right? If something feels wrong, trust your gut. It's unlikely that attackers can fake artifacts, both faking artifacts that are basically displayed by the tools, right? So basically what we're looking at here is attackers are likely to go fake stuff that's not being displayed automatically. They know what our forensic tools are, the good ones. You have to come know the internals, right? This is what separates the Joes from the pros at the end of the day. And look, demand better from your forensic tool developers. That's really the only way to go, because I'm not going to mention any forensic tool names here. I would love to. I don't want to get sued. But there are some out there that are horrendously bad, and they are not correlating data appropriately. We have some major commercial forensic platforms that are still not parsing the master file table correctly. And I've got good evidence of that, right? Some of them hold major conferences that I've spoken at. You can go look at my bio, right? But alas, all I'm saying is, right, that like, wow. And so if we're not doing simple stuff like that, imagine how bad this is going to be. With that, I'm going to go ahead and close. I think we've got like 1 minute for questions, but otherwise, catch me in the hall. Thank you very much. And like I said, I'll make these slides available. I'll tweet out a link to these later today. I'm Malware Jake on Twitter. If you don't want to, if you want to grab a copy of these, again, like I said, I'll make them available and they'll be tweeted out. So anyway, thanks much.